now. Emmet, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
I always love being able to say welcome back because that means that you're a fun person to have on the show. That's not to say if I haven't invited you back to the show and you're listening, I did enjoy a conversation with you. It's just we haven't figured out a reason to have you back. But Emmet is back because he made the mistake. He shared with us that the Treasure of the Sierra Madre was one of his dad's favorite movies. And that was also on our list of films that influenced Indiana Jones. So
Yeah.
it was a perfect like stimulation of events. And not only that, I feel like the last movie we watched was McKenna's Gold. This
Yes.
movie, I think, is like the same idea, but much better.
Yeah, I would agree. There were so many strong sources for Indiana Jones in this movie that I thought, wow, this is the one I should have watched. Because it really, I mean, so many aspects of it were just, you could see, there's so many. We'll have to get into them. But yeah, it was my dad's. I was fishing with my dad. We like to go trout fishing once or twice a year. And I was fishing with him. We were talking about his childhood. His dad bought a movie theater in the little town in Oregon where they lived.
Oh, that's so
And so
cool.
my dad grew up going to the migrant workers camps in the orchards and handing out flyers saying, come to this weekend showing of Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And we were talking about, I asked him what his favorite movie was, and he said this one. And he said he just loved the psychology of the way that money, but specifically the circumstances of mining gold, sort of led everyone to devolve into strip back the veneer of civilization that they had, and you really saw their underlying character. I won't say that they all devolved, but it was a fascinating thing. And then I've had it in my mind of, oh, I should watch that movie, and then I never had. And when I told Cecilia I was going to watch it, she said, "Oh, I've seen that." And it turns out that her family had done a movie marathon where they watched all of the famous Humphrey Bogart movies.
Oh, that's such a great idea.
So I've seen The Maltese Falcon, Casablanca, and
Mhm.
The African Queen.
Mhm.
But I've never seen this one, and I have to say it was really good. Yeah.
Yeah. So also just to like give the audience perspective, the noise you hear in the background from me is because I have had to flee my condo because the internet died. So here we are at the auxiliary, the satellite studio of the Smoky Row coffee shop here in West Des Moines. So there is that explanation. If you're watching on YouTube, you see a nice little pleasant plain Jane backdrop behind me. The Treasure Sierra Madre, I had never seen this before either. And I had avoided it a little bit because I had always heard this is like the Humphrey Bogart's a bad guy movie. And like, I know he used to play heavies, but this is an interesting point in his career because we had originally, like, I fell in love with him in Casablanca. And I mean, even if you've seen The Maltese Falcon, this is him in a very dark role. Apparently, according to Wikipedia, in casting, let's see, so Humphrey Bogart plays Fred C. Dobbs, who's the main character who devolves in the movie. But before filming, Bogart encountered a critic while he was leaving a nightclub and said, "Wait till you see me on my next picture. I play the worst shit you've ever seen."
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting that it's so rare to have a movie where the protagonist turns out to be a real piece of shit, right?
Yeah.
It's like really is a bad person, and yet you go into the movie thinking that he's the hero.
Mm-hmm.
And the last time I saw a movie that did that, it really yanked me around.
Well, and on top of it, so let's get into the plot here. This movie is directed and written by John Huston, who he's the one that wrote and directed The Maltese Falcon. This is adapted from a novel by, I think his name is B. Trevern, who like wrote a bunch
John,
of.
Is John Huston the actor who plays the old miner?
That is Walter Huston, who is his father. That's the other thing that's like cool in this movie is that's his dad.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah.
Oh, and apparently Walter Huston apparently told his son, like when he was a kid, because Walter's been an actor for years. He was like, "Listen, if you're ever a writer, you need to write me a really good role." Then he won the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for this movie.
That's a good role, man. It was a really good role because it turns out that that guy is the hero of the
Yeah.
story, or one of the heroes of the story. But yeah,
So
you go in thinking, oh, he's a minor character, and then he turns out to be absolutely at the heart and soul of the movie.
So let's just kind of walk through the basics of the plot here. So it starts off, Bogart is in Tampico, Mexico, broke. And I love how they make it so clear.
Isn't it like set during the Depression? The implication is that
Yeah. 1925
were,
is the time period supposed
yeah,
to be set in.
yeah,
And he is so broke that he is considering picking up a used cigarette off the street.
right.
Like that
Right.
is the picture of how poor he is at the moment. He buys a lottery ticket from a kid after like he's had to beg for money for an Americano, and they keep making it becomes a recurring gag because he ends up asking the same American for money 3 different times.
Right, right. Kind of has a long lead up at the beginning of the movie. Like it takes a
Yeah.
while for them to get in it, and
It-
and I was not expecting that. I was expecting it to sort of launch into it or drop us right into the action, but instead there was this long sense of where this guy came from that I think maybe should have tipped us off to the fact that he was not a great character. He's not a great guy, right?
Which I think that the nice thing is, so I was thinking about this later. What it does a good job of is establishing what his world looks like before the inciting incident, and then leads up very, very organically to what the inciting incident is. And I love the way that works out. It's a little odd. So there's this whole scene where he and the other guy, he meets another bum named Curtin, and they go and they pick up a job. Well, the problem is then they get back from the job, and the guy, he thinks on them. He runs out on them without paying them, along with a whole bunch of other people. So then they eventually find him, beat him up, take his money. And that doesn't have much bearing on the rest of the plot.
Well, but except that it throws you a red herring because they only take the money they are owed, even though he clearly has 5 times that amount of money in his pocket. It sets you up to think these are honorable, trustworthy guys.
It also sets up the idea that there are people that Dobbs has the idea people are out to take advantage of him. So it does also set up that part. Again, I think they do a good job of how they run those numbers. But basically, in the in-between of that, they go to this flop house because they only have a couple of bucks between them. And there they overhear this miner who, again, brilliantly like lays out what the theme of this movie is right there. In the sitting on his bunk, he's like, oh yeah, and he's a talkative fellow, again, just like perfectly cast, where he's just that old man that kind of runs his mouth a lot and talks, and you really don't pay attention to what he's saying. And he says that gold, he's been a prospector for years, and you get a couple people out there and you get a big pile of gold, it starts to do stuff to the mind.
Right. And it's exactly what happens. It's brilliant how they lay that out, I will say. Because when you're hearing it, you're like, oh, that's not going to happen. Or even if you know roughly what it's going to be, you don't think he's saying it, that it's going to work out as plainly as he's saying it. It does. Like it really is about that exact dilemma of what happens when you have increasing incentives to behave badly. And I was talking with Cecilia about this, about how it's fascinating to think about. So many times in life, we are buffered and protected from those real primal urges to take the situations. Our society does a really good job of protecting us from that side of ourselves. And yet this movie is sort of all about what happens when you are smack in the middle of those dilemmas.
What happens when you peel back the veneer of civilization? I mean, it's kind of like a reverse version of I know we're talking about Indiana Jones and its influences, but like The Dark Knight. That idea of at the end of the day, the Joker saying we're all animals. And the thing I love, so many things in the movie, I cannot get behind, though, that if you had a boat full of good people and a boat full of prisoners, that the good people wouldn't hit that button within an instant of hearing the comment. Just it's a little unrealistic.
I wanted to say, I had this epiphany when the movie was over, that Walter Houston's character, the old miner, is eerily like Sean Connery in the Indiana Jones movies.
That's actually a really good point.
Facial whiskers and something
Mhm.
about the face, something about the way he holds his lips and the way he kind of acts, something about his mannerisms. I don't know if how much it was modeled on it, but it clearly that sort of like the humor of bringing an older man who has more wisdom and is calmer in certain circumstances into the situation is was something that is also in Indiana Jones.
One of the things I love is, so essentially all three of them decide to go out. Curtin, Dobbs, and Howard. He never gets a last name even. It's just Howard is the old man's name. And Howard is the experienced prospector. So the other two, they're like, I guess we kind of need him. But then as they're wandering through the jungle, the two of them are dragging and the old man's moving like a mountain goat. And they're like, we remember when we thought that we are going to have to drag him. What I also love is there's a musical cue when Humphrey Bogart is like thrashing his way through the jungle. It's like all dark and somber, and then it cuts to Howard, and it's this cheery, upbeat music, and he's just plodding along. He's having the time of his life.
Right. Yeah, no, it does a really good job of juxtaposing their attitudes. And one thing that I think Indiana Jones capitalized even better than this movie was because it's Indy and his father, you get that kind of dad, that sort of that dynamic
that
of like,
antagonism.
oh, my dad is so embarrassing, right? And so it's not only the generational difference and the temperamental difference, but it's also the like, and it's my dad, so it's like I'm cringing sometimes just because it's my father.
And one of the things that I think that this film does slightly unconsciously is you can read the Fred C. Dobbs and Curtin and then Howard as the id, ego, and superego to a certain extent. Because Dobbs is very reactive to everything. Curtin's a little bit more laid back. And then Howard's like, I really think we should think through this one.
Yeah. And I quite liked Curtin's character, and I wish there was more of a reflection of Curtin's character in Indiana Jones, but I think maybe there is in some ways that sort of Curtin has this unflappable moral sense that you can see that in he's tempted, he's haunted by the moral dilemmas that they're facing, but in the end he is just such a good person. And I feel like the interesting thing about, if you look at Indiana Jones as being inspired by this movie, is that it's like they took Dobbs and Curtin and combined certain aspects of together to create Indiana Jones, which I thought was really nice.
Well, and on top of it, so according to Raider.net, one of the sources I'm using for this stuff, they make the comparison. So there's a couple moments where Dobbs has this maniacal laugh, the Humphrey Bogart character. And that is almost exactly the way that Belloc laughs in Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, yeah.
So they contrast the idea that essentially there's a degree to which they took some of those elements and put it in that character. The other thing that they really lean on as the idea is that this is the opening premise of Raiders. So at the beginning of the movie, when you get the Jofitos and the whole, you've got three dudes, Indy, and then the two guys, one of them being Alfred Molina in a weird little little role, going into the jungle. Only one actually returns, which is kind of an inversion of how this one works.
Yeah. Even down to the clothing, like Humphrey Bogart's fedora.
His fedora, I didn't realize how high that crown is.
But it's the closest. I mean, I haven't seen some of the other movies that were inspiration for Indiana Jones, but it's certainly more of a match than cowboy hats, for instance. Right? I mean, clearly the look of here you are, whatever the wilderness has for you in your fedora is. I mean, it seemed there was a direct link, clearly, from one to the other.
It is remarkable how similar that element is. And it's what I like is that, again, it's making it more realistic because it's set in the 1920s. So yeah, these guys wore those types of hats, and even as a drifter. Also, eventually Fred C. Dobbs, after he's basically murdered or scared off everyone, there's the bandits that show up. And again, just talk about the foreshadowing. At the beginning of the movie, they make a comment, oh, the bandits would kill you just for the boots on your feet. And so when he's standing there by himself and you've got like 4 of the bandits, one of them just keeps like looking at his boots. One of them takes his hat.
Well, and then they don't even take the, well, can we spoil the movie? Of course we can.
Yeah, we can spoil the movie. It's 1948, guys, if you haven't watched it. And we're telling you, go watch the movie.
They don't even take the gold because they don't recognize what it is. So they're literally robbing him for the boots on his feet.
Yes.
Right? They're like, what they want. And they don't, right? It's like they don't understand enough about what the gold is. And it's right. So there is a purity to what has been foreshadowed in what then happens, which is really quite delightful.
Almost everything in this movie is a perfect example of setup and payoff. Where every little thing, like even there's that comment at the beginning as they're trekking through about the water. So they get they think they found gold. They start like splashing water on all these rocks going, we're rich. And the prospector Howard comes back and goes, that's just pyrite. You know, be careful with that water because out here, water can be more valuable than gold. And we get to a point where Dobbs is walking and we see he's parched. I love that they must have just kept throwing dirt at Humphrey Bogart's face because it like completely is sanded. And he finally finds water and he's just desperate to have it. He has like $35,000 worth of gold, but he's desperate for the water.
Well, this raises like the really interesting thing. So this was kind of the dilemma that I kept coming up to watching this movie is it seems like there are circumstances in life where you can achieve the thing, and yet how do you then take all the way to the finish line, right? Like getting the gold is just step one, but when you come out of the wilderness with the gold on your burros, you are at your most vulnerable because let's say you are tired and hungry and thirsty and exhausted, right? Not only is what you have there for the taking, but you have to then somehow interact with the outside world in a way that protects your interests and keeps people from taking advantage of you who would very much like to take advantage of you and are in a position to take advantage of you. So it's almost such a gauntlet that you have to do and to walk through in order to successfully, like getting the gold is just step one. It doesn't mean that you've successfully turned it into the life that you dream of having. And it's almost insurmountable.
We can even caveat on that when we have that scene, the classic scene where all 3 of them are like around the campfire. What are you going to do when you get back? Howard and Curtin both have like, oh, these are the lives we want to live. They have very clear, this is what we want to do. But when Dobbs talks, he says, I'm going to go to a Turkish bath. I'm going to eat, I'm going to complain. I'm going to buy all new clothes. And they're like, really? That's what like your vision to what to do is? It's that thing where
him getting more with it as he talks.
There's only you have to think that 3rd and 4th degree consequences. You have to make it out of there, and then what do you do after?
Right. How do you even turn the gold into money that you can then spend?
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And it's clear that Dobbs doesn't have that, and that's the sort of that's the thing that sets him apart from the other two, is that the other two, I think, have the capacity to interact with the outside world in a better way than Dobbs does. That they have learned some things that he just never learns. And one of the things I like about Curtin is that Curtin goes from somebody who's a bum, who would like to get out of Tampico but can't because he can't afford to get out of Tampico. But he clearly, in learning the craft of being a gold miner, he learns. It's like such a growing opportunity for him. Whereas Dobbs, I feel like, does the work and doesn't actually grow and learn anything. He just does the work.
He does the work, and it's like he de-evolves. It's like the work breaks him down in a way that the other characters don't.
It's almost like as the gold grows, it has more and more of a hold on him. And he is willing to become more and more degraded as the gold stacks up higher and higher. And there's almost no limit how far he's willing to be degraded in order to get more and more gold, right? Both those other guys are saying,
we're going to draw a line here. We've made enough.
line, and that's what the old guy says you have to do, is you have to agree on a line and you have to stick to it, otherwise it gets ugly. And Dobbs is not willing to do that. And I think that's the real tell of his character versus the other one.
Well, and I made a
What's
note
the
here. What was that?
what's the old miner? What's the old miner's name again?
Howard.
Howard. That's right. That was his. That's the real guy's name. No,
No,
Walter is the real
Walter.
guy's.
Walter's the real guy's name. You see, that's the thing. He has that classic old man look, which means he could either be named Walter or Howard. Either it's like perfect. Like legitimately, I cannot say enough good things about every performance in this movie, but especially like Walter Houston as Howard is the rock star of this movie. He delivers every nuance perfectly. He knows what he's there to do. He has the most exposition, and he delivers it without it being trite and boring.
Right. And also with a real sweetness to him. Like he is not just a caricature. He has a real nuance and sweetness to him. In the scene where he is asked by the villagers to try and resuscitate this boy, well, there's a real sweetness to how he goes about it, and even though he talks about it later with his usual sort of, I don't know, sort of briskness, in the moment when he's trying to resuscitate this boy, he is really tender and sweet. And so you keep seeing sides to him they're really lovely. One of the things that I felt like the movie did a great job of is, what is that Chekhov principle?
Chekhov's
you don't
gun.
show a you don't show a gun. Use it by the end of the play, and I feel like who's the other gold miner who wants to attach himself to their outfit? Cody. So Cody shows up. He sort of sniffs them out and follows Curtin from the village where he was getting supplies, and then presents them with this dilemma. And they're about to decide, you either have to kill him or you have to let him into the group. And they go up to kill him, and the point at which they see the bandits coming up the valley trying to figure out where they are. And Cody ends up dying in the gunfight that follows. And you could say, well, that's Chekhov's gun and never got used. But then Curtin goes to visit Cody's widow at the end, and it really gives him this thread of, I'm going to go visit this widow. She's got all these orchards. I have it's going to be the fruit harvest, which is Curtin's vision of sort of what the happiest point in his life was back when he was a boy working the fruit harvest, right? And so they really it had a purpose. Like he was there. His presence in the movie had a purpose other than being just a weird non sequitur, which I feel like McKenna's Gold was full of. And what made this movie so much better was that everything in it had a purpose and tied into other things. It was only at the very end.
As I was watching, I'm like, this is, I would say, almost like from a narrative perspective, a perfect movie. Because like even that like beginning long part that feels like it doesn't serve anything, they lay so much groundwork for who the characters are, and it sets up the themes that the movie then perpetuates. And I love that. Like even so we have that scene with Cody where what they do is it's but it's continually building the tension for the story, where we're not just getting, okay, they have to make a decision. They can't make a decision. They have to make a decision. Here's the conflict. They make peace with their decision. And then they're about to make the decision to kill the guy. And then, but there's a bigger threat here. And now we need to change plans. It just keeps ratcheting it up. And I love that.
Yeah. It also gives you the ultimate what if of what if he hadn't been killed, because, gunfight, it's just a matter of inches, right? You're either hit in the neck or you're not hit in the neck, and it could have happened to any of them. And how would the story have played out differently if Cody hadn't been killed? Because they really felt in his debt at that point, and it could, Dobbs could have totally been redeemed and never, so dark path been avoided.
Here's part of what I love is if you pay, so in the story, each one of the characters Howard and Curtin both get like a opportunity to happily ever after. Howard, because he helped with the kid, is now like revered as a medicine man in this village where he basically doesn't have to work another day in his life. He just helps people get better.
He doesn't have stars in his eyes about thousands of dollars. He's like, I'm set up for life. Like I have a place in this society. They'll take care of me as I get older. Like that's all I really wanted.
And then Curtin gets to go have this potential at a future still.
Right.
Whereas,
Right.
and that's because of the decision he made to be kind when he didn't have to
Yeah.
be.
Yeah.
Both of those, the characters had the character choice of, am I going to do what is expedient for me, or am I going
Right.
to help? And in both cases, those
Right.
two characters decided to help versus Dobbs, who decided to be selfish. I'm sure that there's like this
Right.
grand meaning to all of that, but
Well, but they do it with a light touch. Like it
they
doesn't
don't.
come
It's
across as
not. It's not
it's more showing, right?
actions and
You
consequences.
don't come across thinking like, oh, Hollywood's trying to shove this message down my throat of, you should do the right thing. Comes around. It's more, it just, yeah, like you said, actions and consequences, and almost the glee that the movie has in showing the consequences is pleasurable in and of itself.
Because like, I don't know about you, but so we get to the scene where eventually Dobbs decides that Curtin, so what happens, they get the gold and then Cody shows up. They have the shootout with the bandits. Cody gets killed.
Right.
Eventually they have enough gold where, yeah, there's not enough really to keep making it worth being there. They fix up the mountain and they trek back. They put the gold on the burros. Well, then after he's come and gone, the Howard's come and gone to help with the medicine man thing. But then the Indians come back and want him to be a part of their village for like just host him there. Essentially, we need to feast you. Thank you.
Right.
And Dobbs and Curtin are like, well,
yeah, he's not really given a choice, right? They're like,
no.
it's an offense to our honor if you don't say yes. So he had to say yes, and he did so with good grace. And then Dobbs and Curtin are sort of, there's an imbalance of power that happens at that point. Whereas I feel like Dobbs was being held in check by Curtin and Howard. And with Howard gone, Curtin was not sufficient to keep Dobbs from going mad.
And Dobbs, by now, Dobbs is like, I love how the complete, like, you can tell it's written so well. Like, so many things I will say about this movie. This movie is written well. When he starts to like lose his mind and he's like, we should take the Howard's gold. Wouldn't that be left? Because he left us on purpose so we could do all the work for him. And
right.
Curtin's like, no, like we're not taking his gold because like I'm defending his gold, same as I would defend yours. I see what it is. You want to take my gold and the old man's gold. And he just twists everything around. You start to see like crazy eyes.
I wonder if Tolkien watched this movie.
So
because there really are,
he's very Gollum-like.
And Gollum, and the sort of like, like nasty, the way that Gollum talks to about himself, right? And it's like nasty hobbitses to get off, or right? And it's like that's exactly what Dobbs is doing, and yet I'm pretty sure this movie came out before the Lord of the Rings.
I'm looking up. Well, it's the book, so because Gollum was written that way in the Lord of the Rings book. Well, the Hobbit book that came out first.
I think came out in 1950, maybe
1937. So this actually predates.
Really?
Yeah, 1937 was the original publishing date of The Hobbit. And then
but Gollum wasn't in The Hobbit, was he?
Yes, he was. So that Bilbo takes the ring from him. They have the whole rhyming game thing.
That's right.
But that said, the thing that's different is we really don't get like the ring doesn't have the same significance until we get to Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And that one, that book came out in written in stages between 1937 and 1949. Thank you. See, we make fun of
1950. Yeah.
So this came out. There's a very potential chance that in 1948, 1949.
When did this movie come out? 1948?
1948. So we have like a year.
Certainly didn't. But so I wonder are we looking at two independent but astute views of human nature that have come to the same conclusion that what happens? Or are we looking at like the writers of Treasures of Sierra Madre secretly love The Hobbit, which wouldn't have been such a big hit back then?
No.
It would have been very weird seen it. It would be much more likely for Tolkien to have seen a blockbuster movie with Humphrey Bogart.
So I think that there's a degree to which there's probably just interplay with these. This is a concept that exists,
right?
And both guys did it well. But I mean, really, no, I thought the exact same thing when I saw, because we get the scene. So basically, Dobbs starts talking to himself like earlier in the film, and then they double down on it later. And he looks dirty, nasty, and like he shoots Curtin, spoiler. And then you see him like grabbing his blanket, pulling over him. He's just talking to himself. Oh, they're gonna say you were crazy, that you shot him in self-defense. Oh, we can pin this on him. And he's got madder than a hatter. Now, this is based on a book. What I'm curious at is, was that all just internal dialogue that then they made him speak out loud that made him crazier? Or was it
screenplay? Yeah.
So I don't know. It was brilliant regardless.
Yeah. And one of the great moments, like the way in which McKenna's Gold would have messed this up, is that when Curtin then comes to, realizes he's basically just shot in his upper shoulder, and manages to drag himself to have to find help. He finds some who are doing something, and they bring him to safety. It's all pretty believable, right? Like McKenna's Gold would have been totally unbelievable how it would have worked out. But this, like, everything is actually really reasonable. And the idea, Dobbs shoots Curtin, goes and looks at him. Curtin's out cold and Dobbs assumes he's dead, and then leaves to go lie down for the night, and then only goes back later in the morning to go convince himself that the body is, that he did what he thought he did, and then Curtin is gone. Like, Curtin came to and decided to crawl away in the nighttime. It's all just it's totally makes sense, right? Like, you don't have to make it big creative leaps or suspend your disbelief. It just makes sense. And it's a beautiful thing when a plot does that, because so much of movies is asking us to suspend our disbelief. And I think one of the things that is really well is that it almost doesn't ask you to suspend your disbelief at all. Like, all of it is perfectly within the realm of what you would think is quite reasonable.
I mean, again, setup and payoff. Everything in the story leads to the next thing in the story. It's mechanically beautiful. The dialogue works. I love that. So when Curtin eventually finds Howard's tending to his wounds. Curtin's like, guy's gone nuts. Like, all these things, he's just lambasting Dobbs. And Howard, like, actually has mercy to a certain degree. He's like, oh, we'll go after the SOB, of course. But he's like, I think he's as honest as anyone else could be. It's just, that's a lot of temptation once you get out there.
Right. And I really feel like, here's another way in which the Indiana Jones, I feel like, is modeled off this. But you get injured, but then you pick yourself up and you keep going forward, even though you're injured, right?
Yeah.
Curtin isn't out of the at that point. He's like, nope, saddle me up a horse, I'm coming. And that's a very do.
It is, and I'm just imagining, like, the idea of, like, I've been on a horse before. That's a lot of jostling. I can't imagine, like, having a shoulder wound. Your arm is in a sling and you're on a horse going up and down, up and down, up and down.
Yep. Yeah. So then at that point, this is where Dobbs is totally parched, at his most vulnerable. He goes down and drinks some water at this watering hole, only to look up and realize that the bandits have found him. And he recognizes the bandits, right? So that's one of the beauty things of, they don't
it's the
even
same bandit throughout.
Same bandit, and so it is the recurring thing. You sort of get this sort of pit in your stomach, because you just know it's going to be the same, right? And they end up killing him, and I feel like this movie did a good job of not showing violence.
Yes. Well, and I was wondering how they do that, because this is the time of the code,
right? It's like it's out of frame, and you see the machine rise and fall, and
Mhm.
you just know what's going on. But sometimes when movies hide the violence, you sort of feel like, ugh, of course they had to hide the violence, but it sort of detracts from something. But in this one, I didn't feel like it was, because the point of the movie, the excitement of the movie was never about the violence. It was
Correct.
about the moral dilemma and the sort of descending paranoia of these
Hmm.
characters. And actually seeing the violence would have, in some ways, detracted from that, right?
Yeah.
When Dobbs shoots Curtin behind a tree, you don't actually see
Hmm.
it.
So in one of the comments on the Raider.net about the influences on this movie that I think is 100% accurate is that this film, so like we've talked about some other films in this series where Zorro's fighting Legion, or no, it's Zorro Rides Again. You see a lot of the stunts and the action that we would get in Indiana Jones.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
this film is a perfect picture of like all those quiet, dramatic moments that we get
yeah, yeah.
throughout the movies, especially like Raiders of the Lost Ark. Every time you have a scene between Belloc and Indy, I'm just imagining that
Mm-hmm.
scene like where they're in that Cairo place and the kids come save Indy.
Yeah,
But it's a
yeah,
moment of such dramatic tension. And but it's that
yeah.
also worldview dialogue of we're really not that different, you and I. It's simply I
Right,
don't hide what I am. That's stuff
right.
that you get from a movie like this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And just that you could find yourself naturally on opposite sides of a field of battle from somebody, and it's not. Uh, you could convince yourself that I am always going to be good and you're always going to be bad, and to some extent that's true. But there's also, it's like I'm here and you're there and we're fighting each other because we're on opposite teams, and like that's just how the world is. And like, like I'm on my team, you're on your team, and it's not even about like, sure, the Nazi team was bad and Indiana Jones is good, but it's like, um there's just this like admission that
Mm-hmm.
life conflict, and you're going to find yourself on the opposite side of people, and under different circumstances you might not, right? It's like they're
Mm-hmm.
your enemy now, but they don't always be your enemy. They could be your ally later on. um
Well, isn't there even a
and
point in Indy in Raiders where like Belloc has a chance to like not give the Nazis what they want?
um yeah, sorry, it's been a
No,
month or
that's
so
okay.
since I've watched.
It's just one of those things like it's there is
Yeah,
the moment where he does have a decision point where he can keep going on with what he knows is wrong, but
right, right. Yeah,
instead do the right thing. Instead, he just keeps they're still footing the bill.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I like the idea. I I like how clearly Indiana Jones was inspired by these movies, because I'm I love movies, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure people who are making these movies are really thinking about these inspirations quite a lot, but I don't often think about them. And so to take this opportunity and say, okay, I'm going to deliberately watch these movies because they inspired Indiana Jones, and then be able to see all those connections is really a lovely thing. Because I maybe it's just because unless you deliberately approach it with an eye towards, I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to untangle the here. You see this movie here, you see this movie 6 years later. It's like they're too far apart in your mind to
Yeah.
put it together, and not a professional critic who is there to make those connections or understands all the history. uh, you're often not going to make those connections.
Well, and I've
um,
heard that
well,
that's the difference to the Spielberg and Lucas era is that these are the directors, and apparently Coppola's like in that branch too, where that
yeah,
was the generation of they were the film student generation. They had seen all
yeah,
of these movies, they were taught classes on these movies, and so they just became so much of a little subtle touch here, subtle touch there,
yeah, yeah.
which we
Whereas the
really
previous
have.
generation would have been inspired by something that wasn't even cinema. They would have been
Mhm.
inspired by a whole other things. This was the first generation that was uh, drawing on that whole the mature genre of movies.
Mm-hmm.
Inspiration. One of the ways in which I feel like this movie relates to Indiana Jones is how at the very end they go riding back. They realize that the bandits
Uh-huh.
have poured out the gold dust into the sand, thinking it's sand, and they go. Curtin and Howard and the other villagers go riding back as fast as they can, but the wind starts whipping up and it blows the gold away.
And that
And
was
the
set up
wind,
again at the beginning of the movie. I loved it.
what was that?
At the beginning of the movie, as they're going out for their first like for the prospecting, they get caught in what's called a northerner. And it's
Oh
the
yes,
northern
I
wind
remember that.
blowing. Again, they
Yeah,
set it up right there at the beginning.
yeah, and it's that same the tendency in Indiana Jones and also in McKenna's Gold to sort of like have everything fall apart at the end,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the
Yep.
thing the thing that is everyone's desire falls out of reach. The temple crumbles. The canyon collapses. Everything falls apart. And in this case, it's the gold dust gets blown
Floats
away
away.
and it's just completely gone. There's nothing you can do to get it back. There's no salvaging it. It's gone. And um, and what that sets you up for is a moment of philosophical um, resignation,
Mm-hmm.
where this is what Howard does, where he just says, you got to laugh because the universe just played, a
A very expensive.
35,000, a 10-month trick on you. But I feel like in Indiana Jones, it's the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't get the Holy Grail; it
Yeah.
falls into a crevasse. They don't get
Mm-hmm.
right the different things
The
that he is
chakra
seeking. He
stones are
doesn't
given up. The
exactly,
arc goes into the government Area 51 warehouse.
right, and it's he has to philosophically resign himself to the fact that he's not going to get the resolution that he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a great way for a movie to end because it's just so true. It's sort of you're back at the beginning where you started again,
Mm-hmm.
having gone on a journey, come back again. Here you are back at the beginning, and the only thing that you really have different is the wisdom of that you gained over the process.
Yeah.
And maybe you're in a better position in other ways, right? Clearly, Howard.
They got the hides, so they do have something.
Right. So they bettered themselves in the sense that they're moving on with their lives and they're not stuck in Tampico anymore. But I think the giving up the thing is a really important part of the process.
Yeah. I loved so Curtin has a line that I pulled off of IMDb because it was so good. The worst ain't so bad when it finally happens, not as bad as you figure it'll be before it's happened.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, a beautiful stoicism right there.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And it's I mean, that's the thing that Curtin has been worried about the whole time has been Howard, not Howard, has been Dobbs going mad and shooting him. And right, it's sort of this slow motion catastrophe that everyone can see coming, and then it finally plays itself out. And as he said, I mean, it turned out well enough for him, but as he, now that it's done, it's like, oh, okay, that wasn't like, thank goodness we're past that, but also totally right that it's it definitely turned out the worst for Dobbs of anyone. Even if he hadn't been killed, it would have turned out the worst for Dobbs.
Yeah. This ending reminded me of have you seen the original Ocean's 11 movie?
Yeah, but a long time ago. Yeah.
So spoilers for that movie. At the end, so they got the money from robbing all these casinos. One of their buddies dies, and their great idea is, you know what? What we're going to do is we're going to put the money with the corpse, and we're going to use that to sneak the money out. Well, then they show up to the funeral, and his wife ordered a cremation. And you just see them all walking down the road disappointed, like we went through all of that for.
Right, but it's a beautiful, beautiful moment, right? Like
beautiful moment.
It's a great way to end the movie because it ends it with this final twist of like, you think you had it? Nope.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so pleased that I had the opportunity to watch this movie, or the kick in the pants too.
So I was
I'm
going
really
to
looking
ask,
forward to talking.
what was your highlight? When you talk to your dad, what's the first thing you're going to say about this movie?
Well, first of all, how I envisioned it in my head is not at all how it was. Like, I was
Mhm.
envisioning some set in the 1800s. I don't quite, I don't know. I was envisioning something more like McKenna's Gold era,
Mhm.
and be a more modern film that's set in the 20s, right? You said 25, 26,
Yeah.
something like that. It would be something that feels modern enough that it's like, oh, this is not just in the past. This is, essentially now. Um, that changed the whole feel of it for me. I think it made me feel much more philosophical about it, and it made me think about the nature of money and potential. And I was telling Cecilia, I feel like sort of the modern equivalent today is technology,
Mhm.
and how there are these opportunities to do things with technology or biotechnology or different things, and to some extent you can be protected by patents and
Mhm.
lawyers, but there's the same deal in the same way that, like, they had to, if they chose to stake a claim on the land where they were mining, then that would draw the attention of a big mining company who would swoop in and, despite the claim, just smash them and take what they had. And um, and in a similar way, I feel like the world of technology today is that same space where there's tremendous riches to be made if you are nimble and under the radar and able to establish some sort of foothold before someone big notices you. But there's also really big players who are quite happy to smash you because there's so much value at stake. And um, and I mean, I've always been leery of that scene for that precise reason. And I feel like this movie, because it was a set in more modern times, has me thinking about it philosophically in a way that it's much more um, about the metaphor of the thing, rather than just saying, like, oh, gold,
Yeah.
back in the day, like the dilemmas of getting gold. And it's much more like, oh no, this is about human nature and the nature of our collective social experience with each other, and the binds that places on us, and the paranoia that gives us, and how we then behave to that. Like, it's became a much more universal thing.
I mean,
How
isn't
about
it
you?
a cliche almost that we have these movies like The Social Network, where essentially it's a group of people that form a company, and then
Right.
slowly other people are beaten out of the company so that the one
Right.
guy has it all.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah. And I think, like, the story of Facebook and the social network, that sort of thing, it's sort of the equivalent of a gold rush before any big players can be established to swoop in, right? Like,
mhm,
the big players
they were
didn't rest for the opportunity that it was. And that's always the thing, is like, the big players will always squash the opportunities that they see and try and dominate them. And you have to find the opportunities that they are so far out in the bush, as Howard puts it, that no one even thinks it's worth doing anything over here, because otherwise they would be here. Which I thought was a wonderful metaphor for everything.
honestly, that's why I really like low tech things. Why I like
Mm.
things like books, because at the end of the day, if it is, I like non. It's funny I say this. This episode is playing on YouTube and on whatever podcast feed people are listening to on technology. But the more non-tech things, I think, are where there's more opportunity in the future, because everyone leans so far into the tech world. The real world,
Right.
the natural world, I think, is where I think of it like a car back in whatever decade that everyone and their dad knew how to change their oil and to do
Right.
basic maintenance on a car. Now you have specialists that do it. So you're held
Yeah.
captive to the specialists.
Yeah.
Being able to have like realistic natural world skills, I think, is I
Yeah.
say that I have like zero real world skills. So be aware, people, that I say this. And
I see your point, though. I mean, I sort of feel like it's going where everyone isn't, right? The
Mhm.
opportunity, the opportunity to avoid the scrutiny of the big players that are trying to swoop in on people is to go where they're not even looking, and to essentially operate without them even seeing that you're operating. And I feel like that's what I've tried to do in my own life. We'll see. Time will tell if it plays out, but I certainly can see from various people that I know that trying to operate in the sphere with the big players is like, it's just a different,
Mhm.
it's a different, you sort of, you, in that case, you're sort of operating in a way where you're trying to create something that they're willing to come in and buy, and sort of force them to do it legally so that they have to give you a big chunk of their money. But the chance that you're going to build something with technology that's not going to be bought up or squashed is almost zero.
Yeah, I heard I was listening to a podcast about movies. Shocker, based on the fact we were talking about a movie, but there was this guy who's like from the 90s. He's like, our generation was like the we aren't going to be sellouts generation, and then like once we get to the millennial generation, it's like no, 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 we want to sell out. Please, please buy it now.
Right. Give me your money.
I am
Yeah.
happy to be a shill. For the record, to any large organizations listening, I am your spokesperson. Uh, thing that stood out to me in this movie was just how amazing the writing was. Just again, perfect storytelling. Because I think that's really easy. So even McKenna's Gold, that movie was in the 60s, late
Yeah.
60s, I think, if we remember right. I was surprised it wasn't like the actual 70s. And it
Right.
just it feels disjointed and it's weird. And I have this bias of assuming that newer movies are more like normal. But this
Right, or
movie,
better, right? That you would learn something from it. Of course, it would be better. But it's 20 years later, which
Mhm.
you remember movies from 20 years ago, 2003, that are great movies,
Uh-huh.
and and yet I assume that when I see a movie that came out now that it's a better movie, but it's just a good reminder that that's not the case. That somebody does something that's really great, it will stand the test of time, and
Mhm.
something that can be a cluster 20 years later is not necessarily anywhere even in the same league as this thing that came before.
I think so. Like I was thinking about superhero movies recently because of Westerns. So we had a conversation with an author of a detective series that has the first one like set in 1930s Hollywood on the filming of a Western. Well, Westerns almost died because it was a nothing genre. And then you get John Ford, who's like, guess what? I'm making Westerns come back. And then we start getting good Westerns again. Superhero movies have become just so trite. Like the recently, I haven't seen it yet, but like people were talking about Shazam 2, Fear and Guts. Like it's a movie. It has its beginning, middle, and end. But the thing is, it doesn't do anything different. It is just the same exact movie plot, beat for beat, that we've already seen in other better movies. So my thought on that was we have what retains, like there's a reason that we will remember The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. It's because of the character work, the dialogue, the human moments, the drama between characters, and the conflict that comes from that, more than we do probably there are probably countless movies made in 1948 that were just schlock cinema, that were whatever at the time, but they were like cutting edge for whatever reasons. But this film will stick around because it's the story and the character and the actors giving amazing performances for that story.
Right. And you know how what is it? Citizen Kane is always held up as
Mm-hmm.
like the most cutting movie of its time, and the best movie ever made. I remember seeing Citizen Kane in college, and I remember thinking, you know, not really my thing. And I feel like this movie is actually, there's nothing that I can put my finger on that says anything about it is cutting edge. It's just good.
Yep.
And it draws a distinction between being cutting edge and being good. And
Mm-hmm.
and how there probably is some universal stuff that just makes something good, and making something cutting edge is just a whole different thing. And it's not at all guaranteed that you are going to be both. And it's maybe even possible that the more cutting edge you are, likelihood that you make something that is just good by a universal standard that will be remembered 100 years later as being really good, or 80 years later as being really good, gets lower and lower the more you try to be cutting edge.
And so, excuse me, that's where I do wonder a little bit about Indiana Jones from time to time, because the first movie, I would argue, is a almost perfect film.
Mm-hmm.
I like both the second and third ones too. Like the third one's my favorite of the three, because I guess there is a fourth movie. But there's a reason I think we will probably, like in cinema, remember the first one.
Did you say the third one is your favorite of the three?
Third one's my favorite, but that's simply because I love Connery in it.
Me too. Me too. But this is what I'm saying. I feel like there's actually, it was like the first one, they had a bunch of stuff right, and it was good. But then the second one was okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then the third one, it's like they figured out how to, like they really sort of they figured out where the opportunities were with this movie. And it's
like Goldfinger for James Bond, where by the time they got to that third movie, they had everything firing on all cylinders. They knew exactly what this formula was.
There's a series of kids books that we've recently read to our daughters. I can't remember the author. They're called, one of them is called Calling on Dragons and something else, but they're set in this world where there's humans and there's dragons and there's fairy tale stuff. And for some reason, we read them in the opposite order from how they were. Let me think.
By Patricia Weird, Wrede.
Yes, thank you. And for some reason, we read them, the last one first, and then we got further and further. And what was fascinating was the last one felt amazing. Like it felt totally, completely realized. And then by the time we got back to the first one, we were like, wow, this was like, she had not thought out the whole, like this disjointed, the world doesn't feel quite organically true to itself. She hasn't thought out certain technical things. And it just makes you realize that you can have an excellent premise, and it might take you several iterations to get to a point where it's really, truly realized and awesome. I mean, The Hobbit versus The Lord of the Rings would be another great example of that. There's some stuff in The Hobbit that's just a little, doesn't have the same flavor as Lord of the Rings. And it took him going through that to get to this, the world that we know as being the fully realized world. And I feel like Indiana Jones, bringing in the father was such a brilliant thing, and just the way in which the Nazis were reprised in that movie, right? That clearly they were like, oh, the Nazis make an excellent foil.
Nazis are a perfect villain.
Oh, and it's like it just had some really wonderful stuff in it. When does the next Indiana Jones movie come out? I can't remember.
It comes out June. I think, say it's June 30th, but I'm double checking myself. I've got it on my calendar. June 30th.
I mean, I felt like the fourth Indiana Jones movie had some good stuff and some not good stuff, but in general, I like seeing people continue to play with these things that were great, because even though the odds that it's going to be as good as the thing that's already the pinnacle, it would be very hard for them to be. It's like you get to see them continue to explore that territory. And I just like that.
The thing that what I think has aged poorly, and I'm actually going to rewatch Crystal Skull just for context before watching this one, because then I can have a better idea of, is it actually better or worse? But I think that it's the fact that the Indiana Jones film does a great job, especially the first couple ones. We have incredible set pieces. It's still an action series where, like, we watched Zorro Rides Again, and it is a horribly bad, like, not good story. Like, it's boring, it's lame, it's repeated. It's a serial. It's not meant to be high cinema. But the action scenes in it are great. Like, the dramatic fight scenes are incredible, and they aged beautifully. They're still good. Whereas we watch Crystal Skull, perhaps. I don't know. I haven't watched it yet. My concern is all those action scenes look horrifying because they were using all of the CG at the time. And special effects versus practical effects that just it doesn't tend to age as well. And that's my concern because like I am still hopeful for Indy 5. Dial of Destiny, it could be an incredible plot. I want the plot to be amazing. My concern is that it's going to be a CGI fest where everything is a artificial background and you just feel like you're wandering around.
I think it depends on whether they. I think it depends on how restrained they are. If they go in the sort of Marvel DC universe thing, everything has to blow up and get completely big at the end, then they will because they can. But Indiana Jones also has its roots in not doing that. In the thing that people love so much about Indiana Jones is the moment where he pulls out his gun and shoots the guy who's just been swishing a saber around. It's not the fancy fight scene. It's the position of what you think you might get, but then the sort of like, nope, sort of almost like that sound that like you're rewinding and it just goes right. It's like you think you're going somewhere. Nope, like it's not like it's just hold on there, not gonna do that. And you're like, oh, like, that's interesting, right? Like that's actually makes it more interesting than just having the big fight scene. And I think the more that they can remember that that's what people love, and the tricky thing is that if you think about Indiana Jones coming right along the same time as Star Wars, the thing that people love about Star Wars is that it had the combination of the TIE fighter scenes and the walkers on the planet, the Battle of the Planet Hoth, right? With the skin there, right? So like they had these sort of very early CGI but model scenes that sort of let you think big like that. But then it also came down to these sort of quieter, funny moments with C-3PO.
Han and Leia in the Millennium Falcon, that in Empire, I maintain is some of the peak Star Wars.
Yeah, and so I feel like Star Wars, I feel like lost its way in the CGI world as well, and I hope that we're getting to a place with cinema where it can remember that what people really love is not the big flashy stuff.
It's not
like
spectacle.
The big flashy stuff is fun, but it has to be balanced by the smaller stuff, the smaller moments, as you are left feeling ultimately unsatisfied.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe what's so great about the Treasure of the Sierra Madre is it is all the small. There's almost no big flashy stuff.
We have two shootouts, and they honestly feel just like, oh, okay, that's right. We have bandits.
Half the time during the shootout, they're negotiating with bandits. It's like not even. Yeah, right. It's like not even about the shoot. Like the shooting is not. None of them are cracked shots. It's not a fancy thing. It's about the dynamic happening, and I think. I hope that some of these movies that are continued spin-offs of these themes can remember that what we love is the quieter thing. I feel like the movie series that has done the best job with this has been the Bourne series, because for a series that could have gotten really big and flashy, it really didn't. And I just watched the Bourne Legacy with Jeremy Renner the other day, and I thought it did a really lovely job of, in a very understated way, doing some very impressive things, right? I mean, have you seen that movie?
I have. It's been a while, but I have seen it.
There's a scene in which he shoots down a drone that's coming to bomb him, and just ways in which like he has a transponder in his leg and he puts a tin plate over it with a wad of aluminum foil and then tapes it around his leg and it shuts off the blocks the signal, and just these quiet little things. I often talk about the Bourne series as being my example of like when Jason Bourne is running through a bodega and he's just grabbing random things, thinking, oh, he's like flailing. But it turns out he's not flailing at all. He grabbed a bottle of water, a packet of sugar to sterilize his cut, and then, like a map that he's going to look at and then staunch the wound with, and yet they don't rub your face in the fact that that's what they did. quietly did that. And so it comes across as really sharp and interesting. And there's a lot to see. And there's a lot to see if you watch them multiple times, in a way that a flashier movie, actually, there's a lot less there.
And what I love about that example is what makes the Bourne movies work, especially that first trilogy of films, is it is him, it's a character piece. It's about Jason Bourne discovering who he is and confronting who he is, which is very well done. But the thing that people took away when we get Quantum of Solace is people are like, oh, they love like the shaky cam action, so let's shake around the camera a lot. And we had a lot of films afterwards that were doing the effects, but weren't following what did people enjoy in the movie. They enjoyed the character work. Like I'd mentioned John Wick to you recently, and what I love about those movies is, again, it's about the character of John Wick, and like they have spectacular action scenes, but the action scenes always are building on what the story is. It's not just gonna drop you in an action scene because it's not just gratuitous. It like, okay, to be fair, the fourth one, it's immensely gratuitous to the action, but that's the point also.
That it's that the action is happening not just because they wanted to do it, but because he has to do it in order to get.
They give a story reason for everything, and they build it up through the narrative. And that's what I love about good movies. Emmet, you have a new book. Speaking of stories, tell us about it.
So this is a book that's 3.5 years in the making.
Congratulations.
I'm a professional spoon carver. Thank you. So I carve spoons most of the year for a living. And for about 3.5 years ago, I decided I was going to finally write down everything I know about what I do. And it took me 2 years to write it, and then another year to pull together the photography. And for the last 6 months, we've been formatting it relentlessly. And I just hit publish, today. It's printed by a third party and they ship it. So it's unlike some other ways that I've published books in the past, it's strangely immediate that, you know, I went from being ready a couple hours ago to now it's out in the world and people can go buy it. So yeah, thanks. It feels like a big milestone to cross, and it doesn't really feel real yet. So appreciate it.
Congratulations. If any of you are interested in spoon carving, A, you definitely need to be following Emmet, and B, you need to get this book because it is the Bible for spoon carving, from what I have heard. Yeah. I look forward
I did this book is very expensive. It's $275, and that's for a handful of technical reasons. That's for a book this size. It's 400 pages. That's just what it costs.
And it's glossy too, right?
Yeah, it's like hundreds of full color photographs. Like it's a bunch. And knowing that this was going to be out of the price range for many people, I worked with a publisher last year, to put out a project-based book that's 1/10 the size, 1/10 the cost. Not one, but it's 1/10 the amount of sort of value that's in it. And it's sort of, that one is much more walks you through. It's sort of a project by project based thing, but I wanted to make a low cost option for people who would be disappointed if they just couldn't justify spending that kind of money. But then this is the passion project that I've poured everything I have in.
Opus.
It is. I don't know if I'll ever do another magnum opus. I hope so. I hope my life will continue to evolve. But if I were to drop dead tomorrow, this would be my magnum opus, and it's done. So.
Awesome. Congratulations again, Emmet. Where can people go to not only find out about this book, but about you and your work?
Yeah, so my website is my name, emmetvandriesche.com. I publish a magazine about spoon carving called Spoonosaurus Magazine.
Amazing logo.
Thank you. It's a little T-Rex carving a spoon. And yeah, I'm sure you'll probably link things in the show notes, and you can find me. Really Googleable. Yeah.
And you've got your own podcast, Emmet Audio?
I do. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, I do a daily podcast. It started out being about 5 minutes, and these days it's more like 15 minutes of me talking about stuff like this movie that I don't discuss it in as much detail as we did, but if I have thoughts about the way that morality plays into how we live in the world, that sort of thing, I'll talk about it on the podcast. So that's your jam, Emmet Audio, anywhere you get your podcast. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you again, Emmet.
Pleasure. Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
And hit, there's my stop button.